Designed by the brilliant aircraft designer Igor Sikorsky for the United States Army Air Corps, the experimental two-seat XR-4 helicopter was assembled in December 1941. It all came together inside a top-secret United aircraft hangar in Bridgeport. Building this unique aircraft fell to a small but incredibly talented team of just 12 specialists. The engineering team took charge of the complex aerodynamic calculations and established the baseline performance parameters for the new helicopter. This was an incredibly tight-knit group. Despite being crammed into a tiny room and dealing with limited resources, the crew worked with massive enthusiasm. They put in long hours and completely ignored the clock. The designers absolutely poured their energy into the project. This intense dedication perfectly explains how they managed to build such a complex aircraft in an incredibly short time frame, getting it done in just a few months. Grueling ground tests went on for about a month. During this time, the engineers meticulously checked the performance of every system and airframe component. They tested the engine's reliability and balanced the main rotor. Even though they had to make some design tweaks along the way, the helicopter was ultimately declared fully ready. It was cleared for the most important stage of all, actual flight testing. The fuselage frame of the XR-4 was a welded steel tube structure with a decidedly boxy cross-section. Interestingly, the tail section was removable, bolting securely to the main fuselage. At first, the tail section looked like a seamless extension of the center fuselage that gradually tapered toward the rear. It was not until later, on subsequent models, that it took on the look of the classic, slender tail boom we are used to seeing today. Almost the entire fuselage was covered in a doped fabric skin. The only exception was the cockpit, which was enclosed with clear plexiglass windows and lightweight aluminum roof panels. Now, when the helicopter first lifted off the ground, it did not have any fabric covering on it at all. It was just a bare metal skeleton taking to the air. Later on, the center section of the fuselage, which was exposed to the most heat from the engine, was wrapped in removable aluminum panels. To keep the engine from overheating, the engineers cut cooling louvers directly into the metal. The engineers mounted the engine right in the center of the aircraft, just behind the firewall and the cockpit. This was an air-cooled, 7-cylinder Warner Super Scarab RR 503 radial engine. Interestingly, it was mounted transversely across the fuselage and installed completely backward. This power plant produced 165 horsepower on takeoff. Right behind the engine, the designers tucked in the fuel tank. The power transmission system from the engine to the rotor was meticulously thought out, even if it looked pretty complicated to the untrained eye. Drive was routed through a system of clutches and a short drive shaft into the main gearbox, located just behind the engine. To allow the pilot to safely stop the blades on the ground, the engineers installed a dedicated main rotor brake. And in a stroke of engineering genius, they actually used one of the clutch housings as the mount for the engine cooling fan. A vertical drive shaft ran up from the main gearbox to power the main rotor. To support this shaft, a pyramidal structure made of 4 steel tubes was built directly over the center of the helicopter. The outside of this structure was covered in fabric. It featured a forward air intake to channel cooling air over the engine. Power was also routed to the tail rotor via a long drive shaft. This shaft ran the entire length of the tail boom. Cylindrical fuel and oil tanks were mounted on the floor just behind the gearbox. The radio, a heavy battery, and the rest of the electrical equipment were mounted on a shelf above the engine, right behind the heads of the pilots. The main rotor featured a central hub and 3 blades. Each blade was built around a tubular steel spar that tapered toward the tip, much like a fishing rod. The internal ribs were made of wood and covered in lightweight aircraft fabric. Manufacturing and maintaining these blades was the most expensive part of operating the helicopter. They had a service life of just 100 flight hours before needing complete replacement. To ensure smooth operation and dampen in-flight vibration, the blades were mounted on articulated hinges equipped with hydraulic dampers. At the very end of the tail boom was a 3-bladed tail rotor, exactly 8 feet in diameter. Its blades were all wood. Like much of this unique aircraft, they were neatly covered in durable aircraft fabric. Picture a fully enclosed cockpit right in the nose of the helicopter. To maintain proper weight and balance, the 2 pilot seats were arranged side by side. Thanks to the extensive glazing, the crew had excellent visibility. However, comfort was an afterthought. The cabin had no heating or proper ventilation. The only relief came from a pair of small air vents down by the feet of the pilots. Entry was through car-style side doors with transparent upper panels that folded outward. The instrument panel spanned the width of the cabin. It was tucked under a small metal cowl that visually separated the upper windshield from the curved lower chin glass. This rotorcraft featured dual flight controls, allowing either pilot to fully fly the aircraft. Maneuvering was handled via the cyclic stick and anti-torque pedals. Pressing the pedals, for instance, changed the tail rotor pitch to yaw the aircraft in flight. The collective pitch lever, which controlled the lift of the main rotor and engine power, was centrally mounted between the seats. This meant either pilot could easily reach it. Interestingly, the top of the collective featured a twist-grip throttle, exactly like a motorcycle. Right next to it was a center console housing switches for the wheel and rotor brakes, engine temperature controls, and other vital functions. Main rotor pitch was controlled by a swash plate. This was an incredibly complex mechanism for its time. To ensure the system was robust and reliable, the flight controls were linked to the swash plate using heavy-duty metal push rods and bell cranks. Meanwhile, a complex cable and pulley system ran the entire length of the tail boom to control the tail rotor. The landing gear featured a 3-point configuration. The two main struts were equipped with heavy-duty hydraulic shock absorbers. They were positioned forward of the aircraft's center of gravity. A third gear assembly was mounted about halfway down the long tail boom. The large main wheels had their own brakes. At the same time, the small tail wheel was fully castering, acting a lot like a shopping cart wheel. If needed, the XR-4 could even be fitted with floats. This setup consisted of two long rubber pontoons attached to a sturdy steel frame, allowing for safe water landings. Overall, the design of the XR-4 was intentionally simple and cost-effective. This turned out to be a key factor in its success. A straightforward and uncomplicated aircraft meant it could be quickly fine-tuned. It could be rapidly put into mass production and easily maintained and flown by mechanics and pilots alike. This philosophy of simplicity is exactly what allowed the XR-4 to become the world's first truly mass-produced helicopter. This effectively kick-started the global rotorcraft industry. The historic Maiden flight took place in January 1942, with test pilot Lester Morris at the controls. It was immediately clear that the team had capitalized on the extensive experience gained from developing their previous model, the VS-300. On the very first day of testing alone, they logged 6 successful flights. The aircraft accumulated about half an hour of total flight time without a single emergency or technical snag. Naturally, early testing revealed that the helicopter still needed a few tweaks. For instance, engineers had to slim down the bulky tail boom to improve aerodynamics. But overall, the new aircraft was unanimously hailed as a massive success. By the end of January, after putting the flight controls through a series of rigorous tests, the engineering team was convinced the system worked flawlessly. Beyond standard flight maneuvers, the pilots extensively tested power off emergency landings. This is a critical procedure known as auto-rotation. But the most spectacular demonstrations involved a passenger. A crew member would climb up and down a rope ladder dangling from the hovering helicopter. They would safely jump to the ground from a height of about 6.5 feet. They would even casually chat on a telephone with chief designer Igor Sikorsky, who was watching from the ground below. These impressive demonstrations proved beyond a doubt that the new rotorcraft was fully capable of replacing the bulky tethered balloons used for observation. Later on, they conducted formation flights featuring both the older VS-300 and the brand new XR-4. Igor Sikorsky and Lester Morris were at the controls. During these test flights, the XR-4 delivered performance that was simply incredible for its time. It reached speeds of over 80 miles per hour and climbed to an altitude of nearly 2,000 feet. As soon as word of these impressive achievements reached the American military, they immediately requested a demonstration. They wanted to know absolutely everything. They asked how responsive the helicopter was to the controls, its maximum payload capability, its top speed, and its absolute ceiling. Once the Army brass got their answers, they officially gave the green light for military trials. The Decisive demonstration was scheduled for April 20th. Igor Sikorsky and his core team planned every single element of the upcoming flight demo down to the smallest detail. This was necessary since their future and the fate of the entire company were on the line. They faced an incredibly difficult task. They needed to absolutely stun the skeptical military brass. They had to leave no shadow of a doubt that the Army desperately needed these aircraft. And it was not just high-ranking officials from the United States military who came to see this engineering marvel. A British delegation was there to watch too. Many of the military officials didn't even try to hide their skepticism while inspecting the XR-4 helicopter on the ground. But test pilot Les Morris kicked off the demonstration by executing a series of flawless vertical takeoffs and landings. He then brought the aircraft up to a hover at about 6 feet. He held it rock solid right over the heads of the amazed spectators. Gusty winds made flying a real challenge, but Morris worked the controls expertly. He set the helicopter down in the exact same spot he had just taken off from. The landing gear dropped right back into the very same wheel tracks they had left earlier in the soft ground. A little later, Morris brought the aircraft back into a hover. He showed just how effortlessly the helicopter could fly forward, backward, and sideways, as well as perform hovering pedal turns. One high-ranking official watching couldn't help but exclaim, "If I hadn't seen this with my own eyes, I never would have believed it." Another general turned to Franklin Gregory, who was one of the biggest advocates for rotary wing aviation at the time. The general said, "You were right. This incredible machine can do absolutely everything a good horse can do." The British representative was renowned test pilot Reginald Bree. He had personally flight tested every single rotary wing aircraft built in Great Britain in the 1930s. He was just as blown away. He stated, "We are witnessing an absolute miracle right now. I'm going to contact my government immediately to start negotiating the purchase of these aircraft." Next up was a demonstration of the phenomenal handling and stability of the XR-4. For this, they set up 10-inch rings mounted on poles about 6 feet high out on the airfield. Les Morris masterfully snagged these rings using the pitot tube mounted on the nose of the helicopter. He then carefully carried them over to drop right into the hands of Igor Sikorsky, who was standing on the ground. The crowd watching the spectacle was completely amazed. Someone said, "This helicopter is almost alive. It is like a loyal dog playing fetch with its master." The biggest hit of the day came when Morris used that exact same pitot tube. He hooked a mesh bag holding a dozen raw chicken eggs right out of the hands of an engineer. He smoothly carried them across the field and set them down on the ground so gently that not a single one cracked. Someone in the crowd immediately shouted, "Are you sure those eggs aren't hard-boiled?" So the engineer walked over and cracked open every single egg right in front of the audience. This proved they were perfectly raw. To show off the tactical potential of the XR-4, a team member climbed into the cockpit next to the pilot. While hovering, he talked to Igor Sikorsky over a hardwired field telephone dropped to the ground. He also passed written messages down that same wire. Then the helicopter hovered at an altitude of 20 to 30 feet. The crew member quickly climbed down a rope ladder to grab a package from someone on the ground. After that, he effortlessly climbed right back up into the cockpit. On top of that, during the trials, another helicopter, the VS-300, had been specially rigged with inflatable floats. It successfully made a smooth landing right on the water. The capabilities of these rotary wing aircraft completely stunned everyone in attendance. But the best was yet to come. Les Morris pushed the helicopter to a speed of 80 miles per hour. He then climbed to an altitude of nearly 4,900 feet, and that wasn't even the service ceiling of the aircraft. After that, he executed a masterful auto-rotation landing. This meant he descended with the engine completely shut down, gliding smoothly to the ground using only the airflow through the rotors. And finally, to close out the show, the XR-4 lifted off in ground effect with 4 people packed inside the cabin. The audience was absolutely thrilled. If anyone had arrived skeptical of this unconventional technology, those doubts were completely put to rest by now. The spectators were convinced that the XR-4 was a fully capable and highly effective aircraft. The Military Evaluation Board reached a unanimous decision. The aircraft has successfully demonstrated every characteristic that could possibly be demanded of a modern helicopter. It is imperative to continue testing the XR-4 at the Army's Wright Field Test Center in Dayton. If the flight trials were completed successfully, the military planned to immediately place a large production order for the helicopters. The general saw anti-submarine warfare as the primary mission for these vertical lift aircraft. The idea was to base the helicopters on large transport ships, escort vessels, and shore-based Coast Guard stations. They planned to use them heavily for liaison duties, aerial observation, artillery spotting, and rapid medical evacuation. Beyond that, they considered using the aircraft for aerial photography and search and rescue for downed air crews or sinking ships. They also considered laying smoke screens, delivering supplies to remote areas, laying communication wire, and flying aerial patrols over strategic facilities. Factoring in all the technical upgrades up to this point, the helicopter received an updated factory designation, VS-316A. Igor Sikorsky made a bold decision. He would ferry the new XR-4 helicopter to the Wright Field Test Center under its own power. For an aircraft that had only 15 flight hours at the time, this was a massive risk. They were looking at a distance of over 620 miles. But the pioneering aircraft designer had absolute faith in his creation. A long cross-country flight like this offered a perfect opportunity. It would practically demonstrate the helicopter's real-world capabilities and prove its absolute reliability. Plus, it would serve as highly effective publicity, guaranteed to capture the attention of future buyers. The route from Bridgeport to Dayton wasn't laid out in a straight line. Instead, it followed a long arc along local roads and highways. The total length of the route came out to about 760 miles. For safety, they carefully broke it down into 16 separate flight legs. The historic takeoff was set for May 13th. That morning, Igor Sikorsky shared some inspiring words with his pilot, Les Morris. "Today, you are making history." Climbing to a hover at about 15 feet, Les Morris made a farewell pass over the airfield and confidently set his course. The unprecedented flight had begun. Almost at the exact same time, a chase car rolled out of the factory gates. It carried a team of technical specialists. The first day of the cross-country flight was a major success for the team. For starters, the helicopter successfully covered nearly 260 miles. It logged 5 hours and 10 minutes of flight time. Interestingly, nobody was out to break any speed records. The primary goal was simply to reach the destination safely while sticking to optimal cruise power settings. The only squawk they noted during the flight was the transmission running a bit hot. It never reached critical limits, however. The ship was brand new. Minor teething issues under these conditions were completely expected on a shakedown flight. The next morning, the XR-4 departed for Rochester. The ground crew inspected how the components handled the first few hours of flight. Then they decided to install auxiliary air scoops on the sides of the fuselage. This helped cool the transmission components that were taking the heaviest loads. On the next leg to Buffalo, the helicopter and its chase car traveled in tight formation. Down below, hitting speeds up to 68 miles per hour, the car sped down the highway. It had a large yellow circle painted on the roof to give the pilot a visual reference. Eventually, though, the car fell behind. As pilot Les Morris approached Batavia, the western sky suddenly turned black. Bright flashes of lightning started cutting through the darkness. He tried skirting north to deviate around the thunderstorm, but it was no use. There was simply no way around the cell. Morris made the only smart call. He executed a precautionary landing right away to wait the weather out. Meanwhile, the ground crew in the chase car was hopelessly stuck in traffic. Morris had no idea which parallel route they were taking toward Buffalo. He desperately needed to find a farmhouse with a phone to contact his team. Following a line of utility poles, the pilot spotted a farm that looked suitable. He found a tight, awkward patch of land squeezed between two orchards. He set the ship down with pinpoint precision. The locals were absolutely floored by this strange flying machine that had literally dropped out of the sky. They eagerly offered whatever help he needed. After thanking the hospitable farmers, Morris picked the XR-4 back up into a hover. He pressed on with the ferry flight. But on the approach into Buffalo, the weather took another sharp turn for the worse. The local airfield was closed to fixed-wing traffic. The arrival of a helicopter completely shocked the local tower controller. Morris decided to show off the ship's maneuverability a bit. Coming in on short final, he intentionally overshot the landing spot by about 100 feet. Then the helicopter came to a dead hover. It smoothly backed up and set down with a feather-light touchdown. An airfield line mechanic had been watching this impossible display with his jaw dropping. He muttered to his buddy, "Listen, Bill, I'm either dreaming right now or I've completely lost my mind." A severe storm cell was sitting between Buffalo and Cleveland. Because of this, the next leg had to be pushed to the following day when the weather finally broke. Morris felt confident he could fly on the gauges. He flew a heading and verified his course against the highways that occasionally peeked through the overcast. Before long, the shoreline of a large lake appeared on the horizon. He banked the rotorcraft toward the Dunkirk airfield. The flooded runway was a clear sign that a massive downpour had washed through the night before. Interestingly enough, the XR-4 was the only aircraft that actually managed to make it into the field under those minimums. It was right after this historic leg that the aviation community started jokingly referring to that kind of hard weather as helicopter weather. The very next day, fighting a stiff 25 miles per hour headwind, Les Morris took to the air once again. The forecast called for deteriorating weather. He needed to push through the hazardous stretch toward Cleveland as quickly as possible. But just a few minutes after takeoff, Morris noticed an issue. The sound of the transmission suddenly changed pitch. The anti-torque pedals began to bind. Morris did not want to risk the experimental prototype. He decided the safest bet was to return to his ground crew. After discussing it, the chief engineer decided to join Morris in the cockpit. He wanted to evaluate the issue in flight and determine whether to turn back or press on. In that tense situation, the risk of a forced landing loomed large. However, the pilot was not overly concerned about finding a spot to touch down. After all, the inherent advantage of a helicopter is the ability to safely set down on almost any small, reasonably flat clearing. Fortunately, the flight was uneventful. It is highly likely that the passengers' added weight and the resulting shift in the helicopter's center of gravity saved the day. The load on the transmission shifted just enough, and the mechanical issue never resurfaced. As they flew on, the headwind continued to build. Because of this, Morris opted to descend. He flew at an altitude of about 300 feet above ground level. However, flying over rough, broken terrain subjected the crew to severe turbulence. At times, the helicopter would violently lose 100 feet of altitude. Moments later, it would be thrown back up another 100 feet by powerful updrafts. The pilot and his passenger were violently bounced around the cramped cockpit. Yet, even in the midst of this beating, the helicopter handled beautifully. The cyclic felt just as smooth and responsive in the pilot's hand as the controls of a conventional fixed-wing airplane. And he barely needed to use the pedals. After surviving the grueling flight, they finally made it to Springfield. At the local airfield, the aircraft was quickly refueled. It was then prepped for the next leg of the journey. Morris, however, decided not to rush things. He waited until Igor Sikorsky arrived in person. Then they flew out together to Wright Field. That evening, the team finally sat down to debrief. They reviewed the results of this historic cross-country flight, which had spanned 4 states. What they had accomplished was nothing short of incredible. Riding high on this success, Sikorsky immediately approached United Aircraft Management. He pitched the idea of making his division a fully independent company once again. On May 30th, 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces officially accepted the XR-4 into service. Army test pilots confidently declared the aircraft reliable. They also found it fully safe for regular flight operations. In the broader context of rotary wing history, this was a massive breakthrough, but the most remarkable part of the story is the timeline. The new aircraft was officially adopted just 14 months after the initial contract was signed. This happened a mere 4.5 months after its maiden flight. Even conventional airplanes rarely made it to active service that quickly, and they already benefited from a wealth of existing aerodynamic data. During the government trials, the XR-4 shattered 6 unofficial world records simultaneously. These trials successfully concluded in January 1943. The aircraft hit a top speed of 80 miles per hour. It reached an altitude of nearly 12,000 feet with just the pilot on board. It also climbed to 9,200 feet with a 2-man crew. It demonstrated a range of 112 miles. Its rate of climb reached 770 feet per minute, and it achieved all of this with a gross takeoff weight of 2,400 pounds. Beyond just testing the flight capabilities of the XR-4, engineers did much more. They were actively running the aircraft through all sorts of real-world operational scenarios. The military needed to figure out exactly how a helicopter could actually support the Army and the Navy. Specifically, they needed to know whether it could be an effective tool for hunting down and destroying enemy submarines. At the same time, both American and British military pilots were constantly training on the brand new XR-4. Numerous demonstration flights were also being held for the public and the top brass. Toward the end of 1942, the overall testing cycle for the XR-4 came to a close. By December, Igor Sikorsky had landed a major production order for 22 of these aircraft for the U.S. Army Air Forces and the Coast Guard. By then, aside from the base prototype, his team had managed to build 2 more improved variants. The base prototype itself had been redesignated the XR-4A thanks to constant upgrades. Designated as the XR-4B, these improved variants were built exclusively for specialized flight research. Given the success, a whole host of other buyers immediately took an interest in the new helicopter. That is exactly why the board of directors at United Aircraft Corporation made a pivotal decision. They decided to give the Sikorsky firm back its former independence. Finally breaking away from the Sikorsky venture, his engineering team got its own large manufacturing facility in January 1943. This site was located in Bridgeport, not far from Stratford. It remained the beating heart of the company right up until 1955. Meanwhile, the original factory that Sikorsky and his early partners had built back in 1929 at the mouth of the Housatonic River served as the base for Chancevot for the next 2 decades. This lasted right up until they spun off from United Aircraft in 1961. Later on, those historic facilities were taken over by Lycoming, the aircraft engine manufacturer. Drawing on the flight test results, the military decided to upgrade their XR-4A helicopter even further. This turned it into the XR-4C version. Sikorsky equipped this aircraft with a reliable Warner R551 engine, putting out 180 horsepower. On top of that, he increased the main rotor diameter by about 2.5 feet. He also expanded the fuel tank capacity from 25 to 30 gallons. He then moved the tailwheel strut significantly closer to the tail rotor. Furthermore, he completely reworked the skin on the tail boom, making it much thinner and sleeker. Because the air intake had to be enlarged, the shape of the rotor pylon around the engine was modified as well. As a result of all these refinements, the gross weight of the revamped helicopter increased to 2,500 pounds. Sikorsky chose the XR-4C model as the baseline for the first production batch of 30 helicopters. The first 3 aircraft were designated as the YR-4A. The subsequent variants, known as the YR-4B, featured bomb racks. They could carry 3 100-pound bombs or a single 324-pound bomb. In addition to this, a crucial feature was added to the left side. These were external mounts for medical litters. This allowed them to rapidly evacuate wounded troops directly off the battlefield. In 1943, the early YR-4 units were distributed among various branches of the U.S. and British Armed Forces. This was done to test them in real-world conditions and gain necessary operational experience. The British received 2 YR-4A and 5 YR-4B helicopters. These aircraft were dubbed the Hoverfly. Meanwhile, the U.S. Coast Guard took delivery of 6 YR-4B helicopters. These specific aircraft formed the first experimental helicopter squadron in history. They were based out of Floyd Bennett Field in New York. In Coast Guard service, these helicopters were designated as the HNS-1. 3 more helicopters were kept at the Sikorsky test station, where they served as flying test beds. Finally, 1 single example was sent off to the Langley Research Center. There, it was tested in a giant wind tunnel run by the NACA. 6 more of these helicopters went to the Army's Wright Field Testing Center. There, they also essentially served as flying test beds. 1 YR-4B helicopter headed up to the harsh conditions of Alaska for cold weather testing. The Army Air Forces kept the rest of the aircraft in reserve before eventually shipping them out to the jungles of Burma. As for the sole YR-4A remaining in the United States, the military mostly used it for demonstration flights. This particular helicopter actually got a pretty rare honor. It was demonstrated in person for President Franklin Roosevelt. In July 1943, this exact same aircraft underwent rigorous testing. It was specially fitted with utility floats instead of wheels. It operated right off the deck of the troop transport ship James Parker. As you might expect, the story didn't end with just an experimental batch. By January 1943, military leaders in the United States and Great Britain had already decided to scale up their orders. They wanted more of these innovative helicopters. By the start of the following year, they had signed a massive contract to build 200 R-4B helicopters. However, by the time World War II ended, they had only managed to complete exactly 100 of these aircraft. They handed over 13 brand new R-4B helicopters to the Coast Guard. Meanwhile, another 4 went straight to the U.S. Navy under the HNS-1 designation. The Army Air Forces assigned another 38 aircraft across its training bases and schools. They were actively flown there right up until 1947. 45 helicopters were shipped over to Great Britain. One of those eventually made its way to Canada. Here's an interesting fact. The British took 6 of their helicopters and formed an elite royal flight. Its main job was dedicated VIP transport for the royal family. All this new hardware meant they desperately needed more trained crews. So in January 1943, the world's very first helicopter school opened up at Freeman Field in Indiana. Its hangars were packed with R-4B helicopters. Instructors used them to train new pilots for the Army Air Forces. When they decided to move the school down to Shepherd Field in May of that same year, they put on a truly spectacular show. 14 R-4B helicopters and 3 newer R-6 models all took to the sky at the exact same time. They pulled off a mass formation flight that completely amazed onlookers. Meanwhile, Navy aviators were conducting their own separate training over at Floyd Bennett Field. On November 6, 1943, another major milestone took place. Lieutenant Colonel Cooper personally took delivery of a brand new YR-4B helicopter right at the Sikorsky plant. After making a few quick test flights, he ferried the aircraft over to the airport in Bridgeport. Waiting for him, there was a massive twin-engine Curtiss C-46 transport plane. This was the starting point of a true northern odyssey. It would take the R-4 helicopter all the way to a snow-covered Alaska. The military urgently needed to know how this groundbreaking rotorcraft was going to handle the extreme conditions of the far north. The testing facility in Fairbanks ended up being the perfect spot for these trials. On top of that, it gave them a great opportunity to test out another bold idea: airlifting helicopters inside cargo planes. Army engineers had actually been working out the math for this scenario long before the YR-4B model was even built. So by the time the helicopter was ready, the transport plane was already outfitted with everything they needed. The process went like this. They carefully disassembled the YR-4B. They started by removing the main and tail rotor blades. Next, they separated the fuselage itself into 2 sections. All these modules were then securely strapped down on specially designed cradles inside the spacious C-46 transport. After arriving at Wright Field, the engineers settled into a grueling daily testing routine. The specialists had to figure out exactly how the engine, cooling systems, and flight controls would handle extreme temperature drops. They needed to see how the viscosity of hydraulic fluids and lubricants would change. Most importantly, they had to find a reliable way to protect the rotor blades from severe in-flight icing. Real-world testing quickly revealed a major issue. The special water-repellent coating on the rotors turned out to be completely useless against wet snow. Under those conditions, the blades rapidly degraded, warping and developing dangerous cracks. That is exactly why fighting mid-flight ice buildup on the blades became priority number 1. For helicopters, this threat was much more serious than for fixed-wing aircraft. Even the slightest rotor imbalance triggered violent vibrations. These vibrations could lead to catastrophic failure and literally tear the aircraft apart in mid-air. Under those circumstances, the only chance of survival was an immediate emergency landing on any available surface. To improve survivability, the YR-4B model, which originally featured standard-wheeled landing gear, was additionally fitted with massive pontoons. This clever modification allowed pilots to touch down safely almost anywhere. They could land on open water, swamps, deep snow, ice, and even on the harsh frozen ridges that locals jokingly called tundra tussocks. Meanwhile, this rotorcraft started seeing extensive use as a dedicated air ambulance. It shuttled medical personnel out to the most remote snowed-in settlements that were otherwise completely inaccessible. At the same time, pilots practiced various rescue operations. For instance, they trained to carry simulated casualties on stretchers attached to the external sling of the helicopter. Overall, these trials gave the designers a wealth of unique data. This data had to be urgently analyzed and put into practice. Simultaneously, active research continued on how else they could expand the capabilities of this versatile aircraft. Specifically, by operating off cargo ships and military vessels, crews developed and refined tactics for hunting enemy submarines. In May 1943, an XR-4 helicopter flown by pilot Frank Gregory executed the first successful deck landing in history aboard the ship Bunker Hill. The task was incredibly difficult. The landing pad was only about 60 by 80 feet. It was hemmed in on all sides by the superstructure of the ship and a tall mast covered in rigging. By early 1944, the S-47 model was used for its first real-world rescue mission. On January 3rd, a massive explosion rocked the area near New York, just off Sandy Hook. The destroyer USS Turner had blown up. By some miracle, the fire was brought under control. But a large number of wounded and badly burned sailors remained on board. Most of them were in deep shock. Their lives were hanging by a thread, and they desperately needed blood plasma from a New York hospital. However, using a conventional fixed-wing aircraft for the job was absolutely impossible. That is when military commanders made a bold call. They scrambled a helicopter. Nearby in Brooklyn, Coast Guard Air Station Floyd Bennett Field was home to a handful of HNS-1 helicopters. The moment the order came through, the commanding officer of the unit, Frank Erickson, took off. He made a pinpoint landing right in the courtyard of a city hospital. Doctors were already waiting with the life-saving cargo. He loaded up the blood plasma and in just 14 minutes touched down at the scene of the tragedy. Thanks to this lightning-fast response, the wounded sailors were saved. That day, the helicopter proved its worth. It pulled off a mission that was physically impossible for any fixed-wing aircraft or ground vehicle. It firmly established the United States Coast Guard as a global pioneer in airborne search and rescue. Coast Guard Air Station Floyd Bennett Field became the first dedicated training facility for naval rotary wing pilots. They trained not only American military and rescue crews, but pilots from the British Royal Navy as well. This station was the first in the world to develop and test dedicated helicopter rescue gear, specifically the rescue hoist. But when it came to live flight testing, many pilots refused to perform what they considered circus tricks. That is when the chief designer himself, 55-year-old Igor Sikorsky, stepped up. Without hesitation, he personally strapped into the rescue harness to prove it was completely safe. Pilot Frank Erickson lifted the legendary inventor high into the air, hovering right over the heads of an amazed crowd. Of course, the chief designer could not just dangle from a hoist cable every day to calm the nerves of skeptical pilots. To definitively prove the safety of these rescue operations, Igor Sikorsky took an unprecedented step. Working with Coast Guard Command, he had his own son transferred from a PBY Catalina patrol squadron. He then made him the primary test subject for the rescue hoist. This ultimate show of confidence was the best proof of the system's reliability. It completely silenced the skeptics. On top of that, Sikorsky established a special award for saving lives by helicopter. He presented recipients with a certificate and a commemorative pin. Following the high-profile rescue of the USS Turner's crew, the Floyd Bennett pilots saved their first civilian on April 1, 1944. It was a young boy who had gotten stuck in the treacherous mudflats of Jamaica Bay near New York. In May 1945, an HNS-1 helicopter had to be urgently airlifted by a transport aircraft to Goose Bay. The mission was to rescue 11 Canadian airmen. They had crashed in the freezing, harsh conditions of the Labrador Peninsula. An even more demanding operation took place on September 17, 1946. This time, an HNS-1 was rushed to the northern airbase at Gander. It was sent to rescue 17 passengers from a Sabina Airlines DC-4 airliner that had crashed in Newfoundland. The Floyd Bennett pilots became so proficient that when helicopters were needed for polar expeditions in 1946, Navy Command requested them without a second thought. One HNS-1 crew deployed aboard an icebreaker operating in the brutal conditions of the high Arctic. Meanwhile, another joined Rear Admiral Richard Byrd's famous Antarctic expedition. Navy personnel at the time grudgingly admitted that their own command had lacked the foresight to acquire these helicopters for the fleet when they had the chance. As a result, they were forced to rely on the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard had transitioned out of Navy control after the war to operate as an independent branch once again.